Island of the Blue Dolphins. Chapter 18. The marks she had drawn upon her cheeks had proved magical. If they had, she was now married to Kimki and was the mother of many children. She would have smiled to see all of mine, which were so different from the ones I always wished to have. Early that spring I started to gather abalones, and I gathered many, taking them to the headland to dry. I wanted to have a good supply ready if the Aleuts came again. One day when I was on the reef filling my canoe, I saw a herd of otter in the kelp nearby. They were chasing each other, putting their heads through the kelp and then going under and coming up again in a different place. It was like a game we used to play in the brush when there were children on the island. I looked for Monani, but each of them was like the other. I filled my canoe with abalone and paddled towards shore, one of the otter following me. As I stopped, he dived and came up in front of me. He was far away, yet even then I knew who it was. I never thought that I would be able to tell him from the others, but I was so sure it was Monami that I held up one of the fish I had caught. Otter swim very fast, and before I could take a breath, he had snatched it from my hand. For 2 moons I did not see him, and then one morning while I was fishing he came suddenly out of the kelp. Behind him were 2 baby otter. They were about the size of puppies, and they moved along so slowly that from time to time Monani had to urge them on. Sea otter cannot swim when they are first born, and have to hold on to their mother. Little by little she teaches her babies by brushing them away with her dippers, then swimming around them in circles until they learn to follow. Monani came close to the reef and I threw a fish into the water. He did not snatch it as he usually did, but waited to see what the young otter would do. When they seemed more interested in me than in food, and the fish started to swim away, he seized it with his sharp teeth and tossed it in front of them. I threw another fish into the water for Monani, but he did the same things as before. Still the babies would not take the food, and at last, tired of playing with it, swam over and began to nuzzle him. Only then did I know that Monani was their mother. Otter mate for life, and if the mother dies the father will often raise the babies as best he can. This is what I thought had happened to Monani. I looked down at the little family swimming beside the reef. Monani, I said, I am going to give you a new name. It is Wanani, which fits you because it means girl with the large eyes. The young otter grew fast and soon were taking fish from my hand, but Wanani liked abalones better. She would let the abalone I tossed to her sink to the bottom and then dive and come up holding it against her body, with a rock held in her mouth. Then she would float on her back and put the abalone on her breast and strike it again and again with the rock until the shell was broken. She taught her young to do this, and sometimes I sat on the reef all the morning and watched the 3 of them pounding the hard shells against their breasts. If all otters did not eat abalones this way I would have thought it was a game played by Wanani just to please me. But they all did, and I always wondered about it, and I wonder to this time. After that summer, after being friends with Wanani and her young, I never killed another otter. I had an otter cape from my shoulders, which I used until it wore out, but never again did I make a new one. Nor did I ever kill another cormorant for its beautiful feathers, though they have long, thin necks and make ugly sounds when they talk to each other. Nor did I kill seals for their sinews, using instead kelp to bind the things that needed it. Nor did I kill another wild dog, nor did I try to spear another sea elephant. Ulate would have laughed at me, and others would have laughed too, my father most of all. Yet this is the way I felt about the animals who had become my friends and those who were not, but in time could be. If Ulate and my father had come back and laughed, and all the others had come back and laughed, still I would have felt the same way, for animals and birds are like people too, though they do not talk the same or do the same things. Without them the earth would be an unhappy place. The Aleuts never again came to the island of the Blue Dolphins, but every summer I watched for them, and early every spring I gathered shellfish, which I dried and stored in the cave where I kept my canoe. 2 winters after they left I made more weapons, a spear, a bow, and a quiver of arrows. These I also stored in the place beneath the headland, so if the hunters returned I would be ready to go to another part of the island, to move from cave to cave, living in my canoe if necessary. For many summers after the Aleuts had gone, the herd of otter left Coral Cove. The old otter which had survived the Aleut spears and by now were aware that summer was a time of danger would lead the herd away. They went far off to the kelp beds of tall rock where they stayed until the first storms of winter. Often Rontu and I would go out to the rock and live there for several days catching fish for Juana me and the others I had come to know. One summer the otter did not leave, the summer that Rontu died, and I knew then that none of the otter who remembered the hunters were left. Nor did I think of them often nor of the white men who had said they would come back, but did not come. Until that summer, I had kept count of all the moons since the time my brother and I were alone upon the island. For each one that came and went I cut a mark in a pole beside the door of my house. There were many marks, from the roof to the floor. But after that summer I did not cut them any more. The passing of the moons now had come to mean little, and I only made marks to count the 4 seasons of the year. The last year I did not count those. It was late in the summer that Rontu died. The days since spring, whenever I went to the reef to fish, he would not go with me unless I urged him to. He liked to lie in the sun in front of the house and I let him, but I did not go so often as in the past. I remember the night that Rontu stood at the fence and barked for me to let him out. Usually he did this when the moon was big, and he came back in the morning, but that night there was no moon and he did not return. I waited all that day for him until almost dusk and then I went out to look for him. I saw his tracks and followed them over the dunes and a hill to the lair where he had once lived. There I found him, lying in the back of the cave, alone. At first I thought that he had been hurt, yet there were no wounds on him. He touched my hand with his tongue, but only once and then he was quiet and scarcely breathed. Since night had fallen and it was too dark for me to carry Rontu back, I stayed there. I sat beside him through the night and talked to him. At dawn I took him in my arms and left the cave. He was very light, as if something about him had already gone. The sun was up as I went along the cliff, gulls were crying in the sky. He raised his ears at the sound, and I put him down, thinking that he wished to bark at them as he always did. He raised his head and followed them with his eyes, but did not make a sound. Rontu, I said, you have always liked to bark at the seagulls. Whole mornings and afternoons you have barked at them. Bark at them now for me. But he did not look at them again. Slowly he walked to where I was standing and fell at my feet. I put my hand on his chest. I could feel his heart beating, but it beat only twice, very slowly, loud and hollow like the waves on the beach, and then no more. Rontu, I cried, oh, Rontu. I buried him on the headland. I dug a hole in the crevice of the rock, digging for 2 days from dawn until the going down of the sun, and put him there with some sand flowers and a stick he liked to chase when I threw it, and covered him with pebbles of many colors that I gathered on the shore. That winter I did not go to the reef at all. I ate the things I had stored and left the house only to get water at the spring. It was a winter of strong winds and rain and wild seas that crashed against the cliffs, so I would not have gone out much, even if Rontu had been there. During that time I made 4 snares from notched branches. In the summer once, when I was on my way to the place where the sea elephants lived, I had seen a young dog that looked like Rontu. He was running with one of the packs of wild dogs, and though I caught only a glimpse of him, I was sure he was Rontu's son. He was larger than the other dogs and had heavier fur and yellow eyes, and he ran with a graceful stride like Rontu's. In the spring I planned to catch him with the snares I was making. The wild dogs came to the headland often during the winter, now that Rontu was gone, and when the worst of the storms were over I set the snares outside the fence and baited them with fish. I caught several of the dogs the first time, but not the one with the yellow eyes, and since I was afraid to handle them, I was forced to let them free. I made more snares and set these again, but while the wild dogs came close they would not touch the fish. I did catch a little red fox, which bit me when I took her out of the snare, yet she soon got over her wildness and would follow me around in the yard, begging for abalone. She was very much of a thief. When I was away from the house, She always found some way to get into the food, no matter how well I hid it, so I had to let her go back to the ravine. Often, though, she would come at night and scratch at the fence for food. I could not catch the young dog with a snare, and I was about to give up trying to when I thought of the tallywhack weed which we sometimes used to catch fish in the tide pools. It was not really a poison, but if you put it in the water the fish would Newton meter over on their backs and float. I remembered this weed and dug somewhere it grew on the far side of the island. I broke it up into small pieces which I dropped in the spring where the wild dogs drank. I waited all day and at dusk the pack came down to the spring. They drank their fill of the water, but nothing happened to them, or not much. They frisked around for a while, as I watched them from the brush, and trotted away. I then remembered zucchal, which some of the men of our tribe used and is made from ground-up seashells and wild tobacco. I made a big bowl of this, mixing it with water, and put it in the spring. I hid in the brush and waited. The dogs came at dusk. They sniffed the water and backed off and looked at each other, but at last began to drink. Soon afterwards they began to walk around in circles. Suddenly they all lay down and went to sleep. There were 9 of them lying there by the spring. In the dim light it was hard to tell the one I wanted to take home, but finally I found him. He was snoring as if he had just eaten a big meal. I picked him up and hurried along the cliff, being frightened all the way that he would wake up before I reached the headland. I pulled him through the opening under the fence and tied him to it with a thong and left food beside him to eat and some fresh water. Before long he was on his feet, gnawing through the thong. He howled and ran about the yard while I cooked my supper. All night he howled, but at dawn when I went out of the house, he was